Good evening and welcome to Reality Check. I'm Sanket Upadhyay. 34 years since we last updated our education policy, the Modi government has finally gone for an education policy reboot to change the way knowledge dissemination is done in this country. Lots of new suggestions. Frankly, we are not fully, and I want to say this at the very beginning, we are not fully in a position to discuss the merits and demerits of all the changes that have been proposed, as there are many, and it will be extremely irresponsible to either criticize, analyze, or praise a document within hours of its existence. A detailed study is required, so we'll put out on the screen what we have learned so far in just a short moment, and then discuss with our panel of guests. There are various points, such as teaching in a mother tongue or a regional language till 5th grade, that are being debated. But apart from these changes, an issue on the sidelines is the opposition's allegations that the policy was moved in the middle of the pandemic, without consultation, without consulting states, or without the approval of Parliament. Is this assessment correct? The national education policy debate now begins. Let me now quickly introduce our guest this evening, Yogendra Yadav, National President of Swaraj India, Professor Geeta Bhatt, political analyst. Her views lean towards the right. Raghav Chadha, MLA and spokesperson of the Aam Aadmi Party, is going to join us in just a short moment. Professor Sanjeev Tiwari is a political analyst. Again, views lean towards the right. And Rishika Barua, our very own Rishika Barua, is also with us, who tracks stories related to the education sector extremely closely. Rishika, let me begin with you first. What we notice, what we see in this draft, I'll come to the politics later, but would you like to explain to our viewers what are the key highlights? What is the key big dramatic change that the government has proposed?
Well, Sanket, like you said at the very outset, it's going to be extremely unfair to try and say that we know it all at this moment, because it's been a few hours since the policy document has been released, or rather the policy document still hasn't been released. We have key excerpts that have been released by the ministry. It's a 484-page document is what we are given to understand. And it has been, in the offing for a while. There have been expert suggestions that have been taken, a whole host of consultations that have been done. So a lot of changes coming in. Remember, this is changes that are being made after 3 decades. So it's not like for 3 decades, the education policy in the country has been stagnant. A lot has happened. But this is going to be the new framework for the years to come. In terms of education system, let's look at schools first. The quintessential 10+2 has now been replaced with a slightly more comprehensive 5+3+3+4 curriculum. So the NCERT is now going to be building a curriculum. The age group in the classes for this, has been recategorized. There's a lot of stress on foundational education. Up to 8 years of age, the NCERT has been asked to formulate a whole new policy, a whole new curriculum, which even Anganwadi workers can initiate. The idea is to have everyone to be able to at least read and write the basics. So that's, broadly schools. There's, of course, a whole host of changes in terms of reports, cards, assessment, board exams for 10 and 12 still stay, but a more holistic approach, move towards subjective and objective examination. So a whole host of changes as far as schools is concerned. Coming to higher education, there is going to be a central body that will now govern higher education, substantially reducing the powers of the University Grants Commission. So that's a very interesting development. This is a body that will be regulating both private and secondary education. I want to here say that, this undergraduate system has in fact been changed, and that's one big dramatic change that one can talk about. There's now going to be a 4-year undergraduate system, or rather the option of a 4-year system, and a lot of flexibility here has been given to students. You can opt for 1-year, 2-year, 3-year, or 4-year system. There'll be a credit bank. So if you complete 2 years, choose to take a break and come back for another 2 years, that's going to be an option. So a lot of changes that are being made that is very similar to what exists in the United States, for instance. So that's as far as, the university education system is concerned. There are some things, which are question marks. You mentioned, the policy of educating in the mother tongue up to grade 5, preferable up to grade 8. What we're learning from experts as of now is that this is ambiguous, but it's not something that is going to be written in stone or universally applicable across the board. These are recommendations to essentially make things easier. So where English and Hindi is a barrier, you have the freedom to educate in the mother tongue, or that's what we're being told.
And as you also mentioned, do stay on with us and be a part of this debate, Rishika. As you also mentioned and we mentioned at the very beginning, it's a lengthy document, and anyone who claims to know it all is not speaking the truth. Yogen Yadav, let me first start the discussion with you. You've been associated in various forms with education, with reforms. I want to know from you, Mr. Yadav, this national education policy was, or a revision in the policy was in the works for a while. It hasn't come as a surprise. We all know that a NEP draft had existed. What's your take?
First, one minor correction. This document which has come today is actually a 60-page document, not 500-page document. It was a 500-page document last year, about 480 pages on, when it was a draft form. Now only the operational parts of the draft have been brought together in a 60-page document. I've just quickly scrolled through the document. So,
right. So we're told the 60 page is a summary, but maybe you're right. Maybe what's out there in the public domain is 60 pages.
That's the 60 pages I've been able to scroll through, which is broadly a repetition of the draft policy that came last year. My overall sense, Sanket, and I might disappoint you, because if you must have thought of me as an opposition representative, I think it's a good document.
I never thought that. Please be yourself. Never ever have I thought this. Please carry on.
I wrote about the draft policy when it came, and I would reiterate that because what we have is broadly the same policy. It's a good document. It's a good document for 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, it seeks to expand the right to education entitlements from age 6 to 14, as they've existed so far, from 3 to 18, which is virtually from preschool till class 12. That's a very positive statement. 2, it reaffirms that GDP expenditure 6% should be made on education. Now, that's a long-standing, it's repeated, but I'm at least happy to see that repetition here.
Correct.
In curriculum terms, it makes some very fine suggestions. The emphasis on early child education, which is preschool, from age 3 to 8, emphasis on that is very welcome, should be underlined. And even the suggestions about, reclubbing the school categories, gradations, and higher education curriculum, broadly very positive suggestions. My only concern areas are 3. Number one, I think the attention on the equity dimension of education is somewhat perfunctory. It mentioned, but nothing really biting there. Second, unlike the draft, the final document does mention concerns about commercialization and privatization. But again, nothing very concrete there. It's just a word that's mentioned, but nothing very concrete. And these are the real challenges. My third worry continues to be the institutional apparatus of Rashtriya Shiksha Ayog, presided over by the Prime Minister. We need a body of that kind. We already have something like CAVE, which exists. It could have been improved. It could have been more like the GST Council, because remember, it's a subject on which you have to take the states on board. Something driven by Prime Minister is not a good idea there. But overall, I would say, if your concern was, is it a synchronization document? Is it a document which is out and out going to withdraw public investment from education? At least the document does not say so. The problem, Sanket, has always been that our education documents have always been very nice. The policy as it is practiced in reality has always been very different from the education policy.
Very significant point. Very significant point. What is there in the policy and what is there in reality are 2 different realities, essentially. That's the point that Yogen Yadav seems to be making. Raghav Chadda, I want to come to you. In a state like Delhi, what is your assessment of this policy? I believe you feel
I think I join.
Yeah.
Well, I join Mr. Yadav in saying that yes, on paper, aesthetically, this policy seems to be saying all the right things. And I'll go to the extent of, in fact, calling it, a laundry list of pipe dreams. And I call it pipe dreams simply because I have my doubts with regards to the attainability of these dreams. Now, you see, what we'll do is fine, but how we'll do this is, I think, the larger question that all of us need to address. As the previous speaker also pointed out that, yes, this policy document does certainly, outline, in fact, not the policy document, the small version, the abridged version that has been put out in the public domain, does highlight that, 6% of GDP is what we're committing as far as spending towards education is concerned. But that was the demand that was even there in the 1968 Kothari Commission. Kothari Commission back in 1968 also said the exact same thing, that we as a country will commit 6% of our overall GDP towards spending on education. Unfortunately, that wasn't done. So the fact is that
how much is that percentage?
Sorry?
How much is that percentage? The ratio
it's
to...
not, Sanket, it's not really about the percentage. It's actually about honoring one's commitment. Now, these, to my mind, as far as the attainability of this is concerned, are just lofty ideas, simply because the government has not come out with a roadmap as to how they will attain these goals. All this seems to be like a document of wishful thinking, which has already been produced by several committees, and Mr. Yadav has served on several such committees where the exact same things have been discussed. Now, in fact, I'll go to the extent of saying, Sanket, that many of these things, like critical thinking, like emotional development, like capacity building of teachers, like early child education, so on and so forth, are already being implemented by the government of Delhi. And we are doing this simply because we committed ourselves to spending 25% of the annual budget of the government towards education. We committed ourselves. And lastly, in conclusion, let me say this. We live in a country where we have a law to limit our fiscal deficit. We have a law passed by the parliament which limits our fiscal deficit and spending accordingly. Why don't we have a law that, and this is something that our Honorable Deputy Chief Minister, Mr. Manish Sisodia, who also looks after the education portfolio, has pointed out again and again in the CABE meetings, that we also need a law that in fact gives the minimum percentage of the overall spending of the government towards education, because that will actually reflect the government's commitment. There is, one can certainly debate what's right and what's wrong in the policy. Overall, it looks like aesthetically a very pleasing document.
Guarantee an amount under law. But, again, I'm sure a lot of people will then say that, how do you ensure that the money allotted is reaching or fulfilling its desired goal? I mean, there are various implementation issues which both you as well as Yogen Yadav have highlighted. Geeta Bhatt and Professor Sanjeev Tiwari, one by one. Professor Tiwari, let's begin with Geeta Bhatt first. I'll come to you, Professor Tiwari, in just a short moment. Geeta Bhatt, apart from what has been said, while I would want your comment that it's fantastic to be thinking of rebooting your education policy, but how do you implement it on the ground? How do things change on the ground? The vision, what stopped the government from, say, for instance, spending 6% of GDP in an existing policy?
Well, Sanketji, first of all, as far as increasing the 6% GDP on education is concerned, definitely that is something which every government, for the more than last 70 years has aspired for. And I'm sure that, the spirit of this document, in which it has been said that eventually we will be moving towards, spending 6% of the GDP, will definitely happen in due course. However, I think it is, let us not, the way the policy is being trivialized, that is something which is not, is required at this time, because this definitely is, national education policy which has ushered in and which will usher in, a transformational change, a pedagogical change, both in the primary education and in the higher education, and will prove to be, a touchstone in education, especially in terms of decolonizing of education, of society, and eventually nurturing, intellect and a mindset which is very Indic in nature. So that is something which is a very, very positive and affirmative note of this policy, and which Yogendra Yadav ji also has already summarized. I wouldn't like to repeat it again, but it is very important that one very important aspect is introducing the liberal education, which has come, which is something which is going to really change the way education has been happening in this country. There have been questions where people have been raising, why is it that Indian students, they want to go abroad and study, because there are not many options which are available for them in higher education. And at the same time, if you look at the school education, the most important thing is that giving education to a student, to a primary student, or a student of a child of 3 to 6 years age, in the native language, in the mother tongue, is something which is going to phenomenally change the way these students will eventually grow up and become adults.
Okay, I don't think Yogen Yadav quite agrees with that last bit that you said. But Mr. Yadav, I'll come back to you. I believe my colleague Rishika has a question for Professor Tiwari. Yeah.
Well, I just want to ask Professor Tiwari, one of the big criticisms that has come in already, and this is just, based on a couple of experts that one has spoken to since the policy has been released today, is that in a certain sense, cutting the teeth of the University Grants Commission and having a central body for higher education for private and public institutions, higher education institutions, as well as a national body to govern research. Is the center somewhere guilty of over-centralization? How would you respond to that critique, sir?
See, as far as this policy is concerned, I'm quite right. Mr. Yogendra Yadav was quite right in the beginning and outset itself, that he welcomed this policy. And not only the school education, the higher education is also emphasized. You look into the entire world and you will find that since last 34 years, we could not make any substantial reforms in the education, number one. Although the reforms was tried at the very piecemeal level, but it was not feasible. Now, when we'll go to that, in the higher education, we'll find the multiplicity of the bodies which are basically regulating, commanding, monitoring, and funding the different institutions. And for that purpose, the Higher Education Commission of India, which is proposed in this particular policy document, in which one is responsible for the regulation, that is NHERC, and National Higher Education Regulatory Commission. The other is the General Education Council, which will be put the standard setting and do its things. And the third is the funding, that is the Higher Education Grant Council for the entire country. And the fourth is for the accreditation, that is the NAT. And that is why when we'll go for the entire country, we'll find that more than 725 universities are here in our country. Around 725 universities are here in our country. When Mr. Yogendra Yadav was in the UGC, as a member of the UGC, at that time the number was very low. And at the same time, Geetaji was quite right that a number of students, they are going and opting out either to the US or to the European countries or to the Singapore. And every parents, they are looking for that how the funding is coming. And that is why the government is of the view that treat all of them at par, number one. Number two, we are the signatories of the, that is the WTO. And according to that, way back, our government had committed that in the coming 20-25 years, we are going to open our higher education and other system for the other institution. That is also a commitment, I think.
You do present okay, Professor Tiwari, you've presented your case. One moment, Yogen Yadav wanted to come in. The last bit that that Geeta Bhatt spoke about, you do not quite agree, or you did not quite agree. Wonder what is that about? And also, Yogen Yadav, my question on what happens from here, how do you respond to political criticism coming in from the left that there should have been a proper process and the views of the states must have been factored in, and this policy should not have been railroaded?
I think it would have been a good idea to take it to the parliament. There's really nothing in this document that it should not be taken to parliament. That would have been a good idea. I suppose states were consulted. To my mind, that's not the central concern. The only point where I happen to seem to disagree on the language question is not because I disagree with the mother language formula, but I just wanted to say that sometimes in these discussions, we forget what has happened in the previous documents. Please remember, primary education in mother language or home language is an old policy of this country, repeated in every single document since 1960. There's nothing new in this policy on that. It's a good idea that they have repeated, but please remember, they've only repeated what has always existed.
Nothing new.
On this particular aspect, and I'm very happy that there is nothing new, because otherwise the idea that you would do English medium education, which to my mind is pedagogic barbarity of the first order. Fortunately, this report does not recommend that, because no pedagogue in this world ever would recommend that a child should be given education through a medium which is not his home language. This is a basic understanding of educational psychology. I'm very happy that the document retains it. I welcome the emphasis on multiple languages and so on. But the real point to me happens to, is about the implementation. I do not call it merely a vision document, but or a laundry list, because a education policy document is supposed to be a vision document. It is not supposed to be an implementation document. As a vision document, it's good. The real question is, how would this be implemented, especially because the reality is flying exactly in the opposite direction. Government schools are being vacated. There's an exodus away from government schools to private schools. Private universities are being created. Higher education is being commercialized. While there's a talk of liberal education, we are moving exactly.
So don't you think that this new policy, it addresses that issue, or it doesn't?
The policy mentions, the draft did not even address it. The final policy has a couple of perfunctory paragraphs about it, but it doesn't seriously address these issues. And remember, this is a moment when millions of first-time learners are entering our universities. They do not have parents who've ever been to universities or even to schools. They really need hand-holding. I would have expected an education document in terms of vision. My only complaint is that the equity dimension has not been seriously addressed. Commercialization and privatization has not been seriously thought through. And in the absence of that, the governments tend to pick up selective things from documents like this. And my fear is this. Currently, education in this country is dominated by an education mafia. Will this document give the government the courage, or will infect the government? And I don't think only of BJP government. I don't think Congress government would have been any different. Do the governments of the day have the courage to take on that private education mafia? Do they have the political will to bring children back to government schools? Do they have the will to give Indian languages?
Okay. So these are important questions, and since we have a representative of a state government, let's ask these questions of him. Raghav Chadha, would you like to answer? I mean, these are things that state governments can do on their own.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Education is something that is there in the concurrent list. And of course, the states do have, some powers vis-a-vis the implementation of policies, as well as curbing the alleged education mafia. And I think the government of Delhi, under the leadership of Shri Arvind Kejriwal, has done significantly well when it comes to dealing with the malpractices, the corruption, as well as the high-handedness of the private schools is concerned. I think that has, quite frankly, sent a message unequivocally and in no uncertain terms throughout the country. And you have now states which are trying to emulate the model that Shri Arvind Kejriwal and Manish Sisodia have implemented in Delhi. Regarding Mr. Yadav's, classification of this document as a vision document, look, I don't differ with him when he says it's a vision document, so on and so forth. But a vision document, in the absence of a roadmap, qua the implementation, is nothing but a laundry list of 5 dreams. He also says
you have to have a vision document and then have a roadmap. Both are required.
You had the Sanket, you had the same vision document, a similar document a few years ago in the previous government, during the UPA. During, in 1968, you had a Kothari Commission which recommended some of the things that are already
I'm running out of
mentioned in
time.
the document.
Yogen Yadav, Gita Bhatt, Raghav Chadha, Sanjeev Tiwari, as well as Rishika Barua. Thank you so much. I've run out of time. There is a vision document. Nobody criticizes the need to have that vision document, Rishika. But really, we'll have to wait to see how this is implemented. That's what it all boils down to. That's all.